So hello and welcome back to panel 3. Margot, we're starting now. So hello everybody and welcome back to panel 3 of the 2021 London-Leiden conference. The topic of this panel will be young people in backsliding and candidate EU member states. My name is Oliver Garner. I'm the Morris Wall Research Fellow in European Rule of Law and editor responsible for the Rule of Law section of the CEU Democracy Institute Review of Democracy online forum. The Central and Eastern European member states are the youngest state members of the EU project, and the candidate states in the Balkans can be regarded as the future of European enlargement following the contraction that happened with the UK's withdrawal with Brexit. However, the turn to autocratic tendencies in these states has created tension between more liberal youth and the conservative ruling elites within these countries. So this final panel will consider the situation in Poland, Hungary, Serbia, and Albania, focusing on civil society, judicial reform, and education. Our first presentation comes from Patrick Waczowiak. Patrick is a research fellow and training coordinator in European Rule of Law at the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, and he is the editor of the Rule of Law in Poland platform. He will present on his experiences with civil society organizations involving younger people in Poland throughout the recent Rule of Law crisis. So Patrick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for the invitation. Let me start by saying that the title of this panel is very tricky because Poland has been put as a candidate member state, and in the light of the recent changes in the rule of law in Poland, this is quite understandable, I must say. But going back to the very topic, because my time is limited, I will be speaking about the civil society organizations involving younger people in Poland and the recent rule of law crisis. Firstly, I think we must distinguish between active and passive engagement when it comes to the rule of law crisis, and also to take into account that the rule of law backsliding is not the only one type of backsliding that we still experience in Poland. There are other issues such as the democratic backsliding in more general terms, but also some specific types of backsliding that I will try to elaborate later on. My observation will be quite pessimistic. When it comes to the active engagement, the rule of law backsliding is primarily the domain of older people. According to the research in the field of political and social sciences that was published recently, I was able to identify at least 3 reasons behind it. First, there is a tendency among politicians and the majority of the society to compare the ongoing crisis in Poland to the communist times and the struggles of the solidarity movement in Poland. Judges are generally seen similarly to political dissidents of 1970 or 1980. During the meetings with judges who try to explain to the society why the current rule of law crisis is very bad for them as individuals, but also why is it important to engage more in these crises. The vast majority of attendees are people beyond 60 or 50 years of age. Also, the ruling majority presents their changes to the judiciary as a, quote, final battle between communist remnants and those who are still fighting with them. So there are many parallels, both in the rhetoric of the politicians, not only from the ruling majority, but also from the opposition, as well as in the media and in the society in general, that the current crisis can be compared to what we observed during communist times. My second observation is that the rule of law is still a concept that is difficult to understand among the society. And over time, the crisis becomes more and more complicated. In late 2015, we started by attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the Constitutional Tribunal, but over time, the crisis has spilled over the Supreme Court, the Council of the Judiciary that promotes and appoints judges, and other institutions. Over time, also, we observe a different engagement of the European Union or the Council of Europe, and the whole scene is that this issue is becoming more and more complicated, even to those who actively observe the whole crisis. As for example, Lord Bingham was advocating for, the rule of law should not be the exclusive domain of judges and members of legal professions. However, statistically speaking, judges who are the very first victims of the crisis in Poland are beyond 40 and even 50 years of age. So because of the fact that they are the first and they are the attempts of the ruling majority concern judges the most, it will be difficult to engage younger people. And those issues are of course still quite distant from ordinary people. And third, Poland has a fairly short history as far as the civil society organizations are concerned. There is still not enough capacity to build a genuine NGO culture, let's call it in this way. Since 1990, or from 1990 to 2000, only a couple of organizations dealing with issues other than charity were established in Poland. Even though those organizations were dealing mostly with very specific issues, such as pre-trial detention and whether it is compatible with human rights, or questions of migration, mostly from the east to Poland, but they were not devoted to the rule of law as a concept, and the crisis the crisis that started in 2015 was actually the very first attempt for many professional organizations to deal with those issues. And because of that, only a fraction of people involved in the civil society organizations are in fact younger people. When it comes to the rule of law crisis, their activities are mostly the result of their academic activity or their engagement in other issues loosely related to the rule of law, such as I said, the pre-trial detentions, immigration issues. As far as I'm concerned, before the crisis, I was dealing with economic freedom or business activity in the European Union. So those issues are quite loosely related to the rule of law. When it comes to the passive engagement, we can see some achievements, I must say, but it concerns only a very young people, and there are a few initiatives concerning this group. I would like to underline one of them, which is a constitutional week. This is an initiative of many civil society organizations dealing with legal issues, also member of the Bar Association in Poland. Every year, especially between May and June, about 500 lawyers go to many schools across Poland and teach young people what is the constitution. They try to use plain language. They try to present the current crisis in a very simple terms, and this is one of the example. When it comes to more broad concept of backsliding apart from the rule of law, we can see both active and passive engagement of young people in other issues, such as the climate change, abortion laws. Recently, this is a very discussed topic in Poland, some problems with housing for young people as well. But I must say this is a more European tendency, rather a Polish specific issues. To sum up, I must say that we observe quite a big problem when it comes to the engagement of young people in civil society organizations, because statistically saying, because taking into consideration what kind of crisis we observe, this is purely a domain, or mostly a domain, of older people. And it is difficult to engage young people in dealing with the crisis, mostly because of the, as I said, because of the engagement of older people, but also because the situation is still changing. Every month we observe a new episode of the crisis, and instead of making a more instead of engaging young people, for example, in educational sphere, young supporters of the rule of law must deal with mostly with legal issues concerning the crisis, such as writing opinions, writing amicus curiae to courts, presented in the media. So there is they simply don't have enough time or capacity to be really engaged in activating young people. So the key, I must say, in Poland is the education of young people. If they don't understand why the concept of the rule of law, why this crisis is important to them personally, if they until they stop seeing this problem as quite distant from them, we will still have problems with engaging young people into this topic. And that concludes my statement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's very useful and informative intervention, which may seem to suggest that these rule of law issues in Poland and Hungary, which so sees legal academics, perhaps haven't had that cut through into the younger population. Our next presentation will come from Teodora Meliokovic, who is an SGD researcher at the CEU, Central European University, a managing editor of the IVR Serbia Belgrade Legal Theory Group, and an assistant editor of the Review of Democracy. Teodora will discuss judicial reforms in Serbia as part of EU candidate status and their impact for young people. The floor is yours, Teodora.
Okay, you can hear me now. Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here today with all of you. I have a PowerPoint presentation, so I can try to share it, but it's not necessary if it doesn't work. Let me just see. Okay, do you see it? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you again, Oliver, for this introduction. I would say it's rather interesting, and I'm glad that in this panel today we are discussing both the situation in declining states of the European Union, but also member states such as Serbia and Albania, which are currently undergoing the judicial reform. I think it's especially important to compare these, let's say, two very different states, because from my perspective, or at least from Serbian perspective, we see a decline, or sort of decline, in the European Union, and from Serbian perspective, it doesn't seem like we even reached that part from which we should decline. So yeah, it is interesting, but on the other side, I think that my presentation today will bring some positive I would say, some positive findings from Serbia. The topic is very timely because the judicial reform is currently undergoing its procedure in Parliament. Actually, it was adopted a few days ago, and it will be submitted to obligatory referendum next month. So I think it's this is a good opportunity to discuss this while it's happening. As you all know, Serbia has been, let me just see. Okay, sorry. As you all know, Serbia has been a candidate state for a long time now to the European Union. And in accordance with the Copenhagen criteria, which are all, to all of us familiar, political, economic, and legal criteria, which are necessary for a country to actually become a member state. Serbia had to undergo serious reforms, not only legal, but also political, and also the ones which are related to a plethora of other regulated areas within the European Union law. Today, I will be discussing more broadly judicial reform, because first of all, it is my area of expertise, and also I will be telling you more about my personal experience working in NGO in Serbia, which was in charge of monitoring and assessing the current judicial reform. So I will not spell out Copenhagen criteria. I think we are all familiar with them, but I would like to stop for a moment and just introduce you to the Serbian timeline when it comes to the EU accession negotiations. So when it comes to these famous 35 negotiation chapters that we have to open and eventually close with the European Union, currently, I think in the last 5 years, we have been working, Serbia has been working on the chapter 23 and partially chapter 24. The analytical screening of the chapter 23 in regard to Serbia started in 2013. The accession negotiations with Serbia were formally opened in 2014. And Serbia adopted its first action plan for Chapter 23 in 2016, when the proposal for the constitutional amendments in regard to the section of the Constitution which deals with the judiciary, it was formally initiated in the Parliament in 2019. But there were several problems with this initiative 2 or almost 3 years ago now. After which there was a substantial delay and I would say stalemate within this procedure itself. The initiative was later relaunched, I think, last year in December in 2020, and now we are finally seeing into 2019, and now we are finally seeing the outcomes of it. So why it was problematic in 2018, the initiative? Well, first of all, I will address that later more specifically, but the problem was that the whole process was very intransparent. So the NGOs, the civil society, they were completely, let's say, excluded from the drafting of the amendments themselves and from the public debate of those amendments. Finally, the Ministry of Justice came with the they came with the draft, which was submitted to the Venice Commission as well, but it was visible not only to Venice Commission, but also to the public, both in Serbia and in international sphere, that those reforms were not really in accordance nor with the EU requirements or with the Council of Europe requirements under the Venice Commission authority and also jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. So until now, specifically in regard to these draft amendments of the constitutional amendments in regard to judiciary, there were 4 opinions of the Venice Commission. Why am I mentioning these Venice Commission reports and opinions? Firstly, they are very important. I would not say they're not source of law, but they are very important reference in Serbia when it comes to analysis of the current reforms. And public opinion does rely on them, at least the informed public opinion. By that I mean lawyers. So mostly we can track the trajectory of the reform through these opinions. As I already said, the first opinion was not really satisfactory, which was in 2018, which was problematic because the government didn't really say that in public. So in that sense, there was discrepancy between the actual Venice Commission stance on the actual reforms and what was translated into public sphere in Serbia. It was visible that the reform couldn't go through because the proposals within that draft were not in accordance with the standards. I will not go into detail, but for example, the complete change of the High Judicial Council or High Prosecutorial Council. For example, the majority of members were not judges, which is not acceptable in accordance with the Council of Europe's standards or jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights. There was a huge, in 2018, the actually public, as I also mentioned, again, emphasized the informed public, highly criticized the reform, and something had to be done and something had to change. So they relaunched it in 2020, and the government actually created a committee, constitutional committee, which would work on this reform and which would come up with a new draft. I would say that after this commission was formed, the new draft is substantially better than the previous one, which is also the opinion of the Venice Commission. So I would say finally now the current version, which was adopted a few days ago, it's not perfect, obviously, but much better than it was in 2018. And now I will finally say what the reform is and what are the biggest changes of which this judicial reform brings to Serbia. First of all, I'm not sure if you were familiar with it, but Serbia had a 3-year probationary mandate for judges and prosecutors, which was problematic, and Venice Commission already pointed that out many years ago, because it was not in accordance with the security of judicial position. So that was removed, which we find very important. Secondly, the judges and prosecutors will not be chosen or elected by National Assembly anymore. They will be completely elected and dismissed and subject to disciplinary procedures by High Judicial Council, which is in accordance with opinions of the Venice Commission and also Council of Europe standards. Also, the composition of the High Judicial Council and High Prosecutorial Council is completely changed. The ground for disciplinary procedure against judges and prosecutors have been precisely defined, which was not the case earlier. We introduced the principle of non-transferability of judges, and the functional immunity for judges and prosecutors was introduced. These are just, I would say, these are just the most important changes, but the whole section which deals with the judicial sector has been changed and improved. So in the end, this is what we have now, the latest draft, although, as you said, sometimes it's really hard to follow it, because again, the problem of transparency is still there. But in the end, this is what we're left with. And I think overall, this is not at least the worst case scenario, because the first draft really would be even worse than what we have now. So I would say this is a rather positive change. Okay, I already explained the problem of transparency and the socio-political background. yeah, this is important. As I didn't mention it before, why it was so important that the judges and prosecutors are not longer elected by the National Assembly, but by High Judicial Council, is the fact that currently and for a long time now in Serbia, the ruling party has two-thirds majority in the National Assembly, which least to say makes it difficult to have an efficient and fruitful public discussion around the reform, and not to mention anything else. So in that sense, the public and also Venice Commission realized that the National Assembly, and not only National Assembly, but political branches of government should be not excluded, but really should be moved away from the process of the election of judges and prosecutors. This is what happened now. Do I think that this will bring some huge change into Serbian system? Well, let's just say we can give Serbian judiciary benefit of the doubt for the future. But I would definitely say that the reform which we have now, if we go through it and if Serbian citizens vote for it in the referendum, which is scheduled for January 16 next month, if it goes through, I definitely think that we will have legislation and we will have constitutional, finally we will have constitutional design which is in accordance with the European standards, but that definitely isn't enough. Because until the socio-political background in Serbia changes, I don't think that the provisions themselves can provide sufficient guarantees for the judges and prosecutors and its independence under Serbian constitutional architecture. This is broadly about the reform itself. I didn't want to take too much time. If you have any question, I'm happy to answer. And now I will just speak shortly about my own experience through this reform. I was engaged in civil sector within the Judicial Research Center. That's, I would say, the only, I mean, there are many NGOs which were following judicial reform and which were criticizing, but they were not, honestly, they were not heard in public sphere, at least not as much as the government, due to limited possibility of any kind of opposition in public sphere, to be honest, in Serbia. So I was engaged in an expert group, which was comprised of constitutional law professors, judges, and prosecutors. Of course, I was just assisting them as a junior scholar. But it was honestly a great experience to hear a true professional opposition and actually to work with them. The final product of our project, which aimed at assessing the reform, was creation of alternative model of amendments. So basically what the expert group did was worked parallelly with the government's working group. And we did the same thing. So we created model of amendments, which in the opinion of the experts within this Judicial Research Center is in accordance with European standards, but not only that, it's necessary for future of Serbian judges. I think that now if we compare the model which we created within the NGO sector and the government's latest model, there are differences. Of course, our model is much more progressive, but still I think that the most serious concerns were addressed, and I would not say because of some huge benevolency of Serbian government, but simply because that's a requirement of the EU accession negotiations. In that sense, I was really happy to work with people, to work with judges and prosecutors, to work with former members of the High Judicial Council and High Prosecutorial Council, and actually hear what the situation is on the ground. Because, to be honest, I was really interested in hearing the experience of the previous speaker from Poland, Patrick, because to be honest, the judicial reform is really not a popular topic in Serbia, and I would not say that citizens really discuss that over their lunch. So we do have a problem of, let's say, democratizing this rule of law issue in Serbia. in that sense, I would say that this whole judicial reform is going rather quietly because we have other issues going on in Serbia right now and protests due to other reasons. And for that reason, I'm not sure what the real value of this judicial reform is in this democratic sense, like whether it will really produce some huge reform in practice. But at least we can now say that on paper, our constitutional design is will be in accordance with the requirements of both the EU and Council of Europe. Thank you for your attention, and if you have any question, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Theodora. Again, very informative, and I think it's quite interesting to see that perhaps there is a reverse phenomenon to Poland, where there are judicial reforms to make Serbia more in line with international and European standards. But even despite this, there may still not be that cut through where there is engagement from the wider public and young people in particular. And thank you for sharing your experiences as a more junior researcher in those areas. Our third presentation comes from our representative from Leiden on this panel, which is Dr. Darinka Pekani. And Darinka is an assistant professor of EU law in the Europa Institute of Leiden Law School. And she's previously worked for the Albanian Helsinki Committee and volunteered for the Albanian Red Cross and participated in the Albanian National Debate Association. So like Theodora and Patrick, she's had experience in civil society in Albania. She will discuss judicial reforms in Albania in light of its candidate status and also the prospects for the future. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Oliver, also for the introduction, although you brought me many years ago when I was still a student, when I was working for the Helsinki Committee and volunteering for the Red Cross, but that feels good. So yeah, I'm going to tell you a bit more about the judicial reform in Albania. Now from a different perspective. So we heard from Patrick about current member states. We heard from Theodora on Serbia as a country that has started accession negotiations with the European Union, and now the story of Albania is the story of candidate country since June 2014 that is still waiting now since 2018, a year in which the European Commission officially recommended the opening of accession negotiations with Albania and with Northern Macedonia. So the country is waiting now for 3 years for the green light from the member states of the European Union to open accession negotiations and to approve the negotiation framework and to hold the first intergovernmental conference. What I wanted to focus on today is the question whether the EU enlargement policy in Albania or generally in the Western Balkans, because I think a lot of the things here maybe also relate to Northern Macedonia, whether the EU enlargement policy, there is a risk that it loses the credibility in the Western Balkans. By now, I think this sounds almost like a cliche, because it's very much used. You see it really has made the headlines. It does make the headlines very often. I think that, a general impression that I have from a couple of data and information that I have collected is that if perhaps there is still a great appeal for the population, for the elites, including also perhaps for the youth. At least these are the data that I could access, for instance, from the Balkan Barometer of 2021, which I could access through the Regional Cooperation Council. For Albania, for instance, the 84% of the population answered that they think that EU membership is a good thing. So it's quite a high number. So it's quite a big support. And from the data that I could see is that, at least from the perspective of the population, this appeal of the European future is quite stable. No? So I did not see, at least based on those data, I did not see a decline in the support among the population, specifically concerning Albania. But I do fear that because of this continuous feeling of waiting and not opening the accession negotiations, I do think that perhaps there could be a threat or a risk for losing its credibility, this process, the EU enlargement process, especially for political elites. And I think the case of Albania is a good example because of, especially if we look at it from the lens of the judicial reform that the country started in 2016 with a major constitutional reform. So in 2016, there was a big amendment of the constitution that touched upon very important provisions on the organization of the judiciary. So this is a bit the kind of story that I want to tell today. So whether this credibility, is there a risk to lose this, especially for political elites? Just very briefly on EU and Albania's relationship, I did mention it that Albania is a candidate country since 2014, and there have been since 2018 continuous recommendations by the European Commission to open accession negotiations. Initially, both Albania and North Macedonia were blocked initially because there was no agreement simply to open them, because some of the countries, including the Netherlands, but also France and Denmark, they felt that especially Albania in 2018 was not yet ready to open them because of the fact that they had not really complied with basic elements such as fight against corruption, judicial independence, and so on. And more recently, it's interesting because the reason for not opening accession negotiations is the problems that Northern Macedonia is facing with the Bulgarian veto. And because Albania and Northern Macedonia are being considered together as a package, so these problems are affecting, at the time, Albania or Northern Macedonia. However, the EU strives to, that at least you read that in all the official documents of the European Union. So the EU strives to offer a credible enlargement policy because it's in the Western Balkans, because it sees it as an investment in peace, stability, and economic growth. So the EU tries to keep this interest of the countries for instance, by having bilateral meetings between the EU and the leaders of the Western Balkan countries. For instance, there you can see that in the Brdo Declaration of October 2021, a summit that was held in Slovenia, the EU member states again stressed that the Western Balkans have undeniably a European perspective. And the idea is to hold on a regular basis EU Western Balkan summits. And this Brdo summit that I mentioned, October 2021, also launched an agenda, among other things, on the Western Balkans, on innovation, research, education, culture, youth, and sport. And I was looking into this because, of course, I saw it as a relevant element on how the EU tries to engage with Western Balkan countries to create further opportunities for young people in the Western Balkans, and of course to tackle one of the biggest problems, that is brain drain, which is something that you see happening in a lot of the countries. So it's one of the main threats in the region. And of course, and I'm not taking here now the role of political scientist or policymaker on how to tackle brain drain, because I think there are many reasons to that. But of course, the creation also of the right premises of a state based on the rule of law, in which you have an independent judiciary, fight against corruption, and so on and so forth, which is very much the discourse of EU integration, is one of the factors that also has an impact on improving the lives of the population, including the youth, in the countries where they are, without them having to leave. But of course, as I said, those are only some of the elements. But there are other things such as unemployment or employment conditions, globalization as such, and so on and so forth. Now, after this brief summary, I want to give you an idea, a short a brief summary of the justice reform in Albania, and to tell you, or to somehow explain why I think that was such a fundamental reform of the constitution and the judicial system, that in a way I think it deserved also, or it does still deserve, some response from the European side, at least with the launching of or opening of these accession negotiations. So why there was a need for a judicial reform, a justice reform in Albania? The European Commission, in one of its progress reports of 2015, and it was not the only one, noticed that the administration of justice in Albania is slow. Decisions are not always enforced. The professional training of judges is inadequate, their independence is not ensured, and there is insufficient accountability of judges and prosecutors, and corruption is widespread in the system. So following this report, which, as I said, it was not the only one, but it's just, the last point in time which I trace it. And then from there was a special parliamentary commission on the justice reform that was set up in the context of the Albanian parliament. This was composed of experts, and they conducted an analysis of the justice system in Albania, and they identified similar problems that were mentioned: corruption, a lack of independence, lack of professional qualification, and so on. So therefore, in 2016, the justice reform was adopted, which included the amendment of the constitution, a new reformation of the judiciary. For instance, it changed the mode in which judges and prosecutors are chosen. So a bit what Theodora mentioned with the High Judicial Council and the High Prosecutorial Council. So it is chosen within by input, with input from the system itself. And these are the two highest bodies that also at the same time administer careers and of judges and prosecutors. The justice reform tackled also legal education. So the School of Magistrates has measures against corruption, and the financing and restructuring of the justice system. However, I think the most important, the most interesting feature of the justice reform in Albania is the vetting of the judges and the prosecutors, which is a very radical, I would say it's quite a radical approach that was taken. So what was this judicial vetting? And I will focus mainly on that. So judicial vetting is an extraordinary and temporary set of measures or measure which aims at the re-evaluation of judges and prosecutors. So all judges of all levels and prosecutors of all levels in Albania and legal assistants to judges, they would undergo this check or this control of three things: their wealth, their integrity check, and their professionalism. And the objective of this, of course, was to ensure an independent judiciary and to ensure more largely the rule of law. This was quite a big operation because the constitution, as I said, it was changed. There were a lot of laws that were adopted to implement the vetting of the judges. It was an assessment of more than 800 judges and prosecutors and legal assistants, advisors that had to undergo this process. And how it works is that there is an institutional framework which is based on two levels of, some kind of court system you think. So the first instance is all the cases are reviewed by the so-called independent qualification commission. This rules on the first instance. And then cases may be appealed either by judges or prosecutors or by the so-called public commissioners who are there to protect the public interest. These are appealed to the appeal chamber, which then judges or reviews the cases or vets these judges and prosecutors at a second instance. Interesting. There is also the whole process is monitored by the European Commission, because there is the so-called international monitoring operation, which even has found its way in the constitution. So it's something that is regulated at the constitutional level. These are basically experts from member states, current member states, from the Netherlands, for instance, or other member states, who are present in every of these sessions where judges are vetted, and they oversee it, basically, whether it is done according to the standards. So, and the European Commission is in lead of this process. Now, I will not go into the details, of course. It's quite a burdensome process, but I'll illustrate with perhaps some numbers which are interesting. So what can happen at the end of these procedures or vetting is that judges can be dismissed or confirmed in their office, and there is also the option that they can also resign even before getting into this, and this has also been the case with a lot of judges. So I can give you some numbers that a colleague of mine shared with me, who works in this international monitoring commission. For instance, until the 6th of May 2021, the independent qualification commission, so the first instance, has rendered 378 decisions, out of which 158, so around 41%, were judges and prosecutors that were confirmed in office, and 137 decisions were dismissal of judges and prosecutors. 59 were termination of the process, mainly because judges resigned. And then there are some other interim statuses, but these are the main numbers. So what this means now for the judiciary in Albania, quite a big challenge, because a lot of the courts in the country are having huge problems with backlog, because judges just simply either have resigned or are not confirmed in their duty. So there is not enough judges, and there at the same time there is not enough judges that graduate from the School of Magistrates, because this was supposed to be a very elitist school, in the sense that there were only 10 judges and prosecutors per year that could graduate. That went to 20, I think, at some point, but that was not simply enough to replace. And maybe to illustrate one last point is that I find that very interesting, that the judicial vetting even impacted very heavily the Albanian Constitutional Court. So it was from July 2018 until December 2020 that Albania did not have a functioning constitutional court. Why was that? Because I can give you some numbers. There were from 9 judges that were in place in 2017, 3 resigned. Only one constitutional judge was passed the vetting, and then 5 constitutional judges did not pass the vetting and were dismissed. So the court was left with 1 judge, and so it had no quorum to decide even on the admissibility of constitutional complaints. So there was a almost 2-year impasse of the Constitutional Court, which then raised the other concern of, or the paradox, how I call it in a book chapter I've written on this, the paradox of the rule of law, reform, that you create a situation, even though it is temporary, in which one of the main guarantees of the rule of law or constitutionality, that is a constitutional court, is not in place. Now, I don't want to end with pessimistic notes. The Constitutional Court came back in December 2020, so now they are really happy and giving their judgments. I think it was an important, just to summarize, I think it is an important process, especially seeing from the inside. I've left Albania now for years, but I do see what kind of, I have been in touch to see what kind of problems the judiciary really had. I think it was a necessary reform. However, it was quite drastic. That also produced some consequences that were probably not well thought through at the very beginning, or they were not imagined that that there would be even almost, we are at a stage now that if they don't act quickly, there can be a paralysis of the whole of the judicial system. And that's, of course, not, I think, the intended consequence of this judicial reform. I'll leave it with this note, and then I'm happy if I can answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Darinka. I certainly learned a lot there, and it's very interesting to consider perhaps when reforms can maybe go too far and impact upon efficiency and functioning. So there's a balance to be struck, and I'd be particularly interested to hear in our Q&A the perhaps the contrasts and the comparisons between the judicial vetting that's also been happening in Poland, what may be happening in Serbia, and then the Albanian system, just to see the compared experiences. Unfortunately, our final panelist, Peter Rado, has not been able to join us. Peter was going to discuss the effect of the autocratic turn in Poland, Hungary and Serbia on education in relation to fostering adaptation to ongoing global challenges. So perhaps what we could do is open up that topic to the other panelists just to reflect upon that in terms of their own presentations, and perhaps also then connecting to what we discussed in panel 2 on the educational materials. So I'd be happy to open up, perhaps Patrick, if you would like to start first. And do you think that there has been an effect in the last 6 years since Law and Justice came to power upon education in universities and schools, and perhaps most specifically in relation to how things like the European level is treated in education, and also more global phenomena? So Patrick, I'll open to you. And I would just encourage everybody else, if you have a question, please raise your hand virtually and we'll move into the Q&A.
Thank you, Oliver. Of course, there was an impact on education when the current government went to power in 2015, because of the fact that this party is mostly seen as a conservative. The new Ministry for Education, but also the Ministry for Higher Education, started to firstly to change the organization of the school system, mostly which included first changing the structure of the lower education. Previously we had 3 tiers, and they removed the middle one, saying that, well, because young people go to new school when they are 12 or 13, and they meet new friends, probably from other environments, from other cities as well. This would be quite deteriorating for the education and for their well-being. Also, a new law on higher education has been introduced that mostly curbs the independence of universities, and the possibility for university bodies such as assembly or the senate of a university to decide on most matters that concern this universities. When it comes to learning programs, as I said, the conservative government tends to introduce more and more programs which have some parts connected to Catholic religion. Of course, John Paul II was Polish, and because of that, for example, mandatory books for schools are for students. The list of those books has changed, and we have a part of a huge number of John Paul II books about well, how to be a good person, what is a true meaning of being a Catholic, and so on and so forth. And we also see some tendencies to change the personnel in the higher education, especially because the president of the republic decides whether to grant a title of professor or a PhD or a habilitation to a particular researcher. Previously, it was just a ceremonial decision because the committee of higher education was responsible for it, and now the president started to question the opinion or the proposal to grant a title of professor. And this was especially vibrant when it comes to researchers in Holocaust history, the history of the Holocaust or Holocaust laws. For the first time in history, a number of candidates have been officially refused the title of professor despite positive opinions from academic circles. So this is how it looks like in Poland. And as I said in my statement, we despite civil society organizations try to go to school and to teach young people about the meaning of the rule of law, about constitutionalism in very plain language, we see the tendency that lawyers are denied access to school because of, well, ideological reasons. So this is how it looks like now, and I think it could be, and it is worsening over time. Well, and so that the access to education and the possibility to engage young people in the question in the issues of democracy or the rule of law is becoming more and more difficult. This is how it looks like in Poland.
Thank you, Patrick. It's very interesting to see, obviously, how the ruling party's ideology can be disseminated through the generations if it's made a large part of primary, secondary, and tertiary education. Theodora, do you have any observations on whether there's been an illiberal turn that's affected education in Serbia?
Oh, thank you. When it comes to education, well, not really, honestly. I wouldn't say that, I mean, in my opinion, illiberal tendencies in the rhetorics of the government are not present at all, which doesn't mean that they're not present. It's just that they're not officially embraced within the governmental rhetoric and policies. So in that sense, they're not introduced into education either. And there hasn't been, I mean, there have been educational reform, but nothing in relation to this specific topic that we are discussing today. So I wouldn't say that there is a, at least for now, there is not. That's not the case. I think that in Serbia specifically, the problem is that a lot of things are happening which are not really pronounced. so that's a problem to tackle the issue when it's not really said to be present. So formally, no, there is nothing here, which doesn't mean that there isn't. It's just that the public is not familiar with it.
That's interesting to hear that contrast to Poland. Darinka, is the situation similar in Albania? Is it more similar to Serbia or more similar to Poland?
Most like I would join Theodora for the situation in Albania. I am not aware, although I have to say I haven't really followed it or studied it, of course, but I'm not aware of these interferences or liberal tendencies in education, in changing curricula, and what I'm seeing. But that's really from a perspective not of a researcher anymore, but just as the general public. What I see is that there is this effort to involve the public. For instance, I don't know, now currently in Albania there is the Integrity Week that is, by the way, organized by the Dutch embassy in Albania, which aims at raising awareness of the public against corruption and things like that. So yeah, I would agree with Theodora or say that similar findings I see for Albania as well. I do not see this autocratic or illiberal tendencies in education. I think there is an effort to try to raise awareness to more integrity, fight against corruption, or I see a lot of activities that, for instance, the EU office in Tirana organizes with youth. So there is this desire, I think, to involve young people more and more, and to show that what is the EU, and there is also the slogans, the EU is here, and things like that. So yeah, that's what I can testify. But as I said, mostly as a public.
Great, thank you. And I did have a follow-up question there, but before I abuse my position as chair, I should see if there are any questions either from the Zoom audience or any questions in the room. So perhaps on that theme, something that relates back to Patrick's presentation, where you mentioned that there was perhaps slightly more visibility when it came to what could be seen as perhaps substantive issues around values when it comes to LGBTQI plus rights, abortion rights. I think the question perhaps for Patrick would be, do you see this is the way in which young people really would become more involved, more active in civil society, as opposed to the more formal issues? And perhaps this is more similar to how such issues have been debated in America. We've seen challenges to Roe versus Wade, and a lot of reactions have been in civil society. And then for Theodora and Darinka, I think the question is, do we see any kind of more liberal tendencies in relation to social issues in Albania and Serbia, which may contrast towards the more pro-European and more pro-international approach when it comes to the formal issues of judicial reform, etc. So, Patrick, great for your observation.
Thanks again. Well, as I said in my statement, this is of course a European or a world tendency that young people go on streets, protest against, advocate for climate, protest against climate changes, advocate for the government being more aware of the climate change. In Poland specifically, the judgment on the abortion law of October 2020 has raised a great deal of heated protests on the streets. And I think, and of course, this is much more, easier to understand for young people, that these topics are closer to them than the question of the rule of law, independence of the judiciary. Because look, a young person in small city in Poland does not really care about what is happening with the Constitutional Tribunal or the Supreme Court. These are distant institutions. These are the institutions, let's call it in this way, designed for older people. There are marbles inside those buildings. People are wearing suits and ties and so on and so forth. So this is not fully related to to young people. Of course, as I said, we try to engage and engage them in at least thinking that this is not a distant issue, and showing, for example, that the judgment on the practically banning the abortion in Poland is touches them personally. I must say so. So this is of course quite important. What and following my a little follow up to my previous response, it also relates to your question. We observe the tendency that also students or pupils or even teachers face some kind of disciplinary actions for, let's say, misbehaviors during classes, outside the school, and so on. For instance, some civil society organizations were organizing something like Rainbow Fridays, when there were activists coming to public schools teaching about LGBTI rights, teaching about tolerance, and so on and so forth. And in response to that, the local communities have adopted the notorious anti-LGBT resolutions that are now targeted by the European Commission, for example. And they see that those issues, the attacks on minorities, very tough position when it comes to climate change, for example, and abortion law, for example. Those issues are not as distant as the still very formal concept of the rule of law, and as a result, it is much easier to engage those people in being more active, to organize themselves when it comes to those issues, rather than building some kind of mobilization when it comes to the rule of law. I recall only one example of a huge protest in front of the Supreme Court in mid-2017. But I think this was only because, well, this was the middle of holidays. Everyone was quite free, and this was the very first protest before the Polish Supreme Court, and it was truly for the rule of law, against changes in the judiciary, and many young people were involved actively and passively in organizing or taking part in this protest. But over time, this engagement has practically vanished, and there are, I can count about 40 people across Poland below 35 dealing with the rule of law, on one side on academically, and on the other side within civil society organizations. So this is how the picture in Poland looks like.
Thank you, Patrick. And it's concerning to hear that disciplinary regimes also seem to have extended into the education sector as well as the judiciary. So Teodora, Dorinka, I don't know if you had any observations on whether similar phenomena are occurring in Serbia and Albania.
Yes, thank you. Well, what I would, as Professor Pikani also said, I can only say something not as a political scientist, just as an observer, as a citizen. What we are facing now in Serbia in terms of these other important questions in society, I would say that the answer is quite ambiguous in Serbia. There is huge discrepancy between the actual policies of the government, I would say, and on the other hand, the actual will of of the citizens. So, for example, also we can also see that I will just mention one example. You remind me now with this this example of LGBT. So, for example, in Serbia this year, there was this huge discussion that we will introduce same-sex civil partnerships, which would be very progressive for Serbia and obviously welcomed. So that was actually the proposal of the ministers, which are part of the ruling government. But then when the discussion came to the public debate, the president himself said that he would not sign the law because it's contrary to our family law and it's contrary to our constitution. So we here have one political party which is expressing different opinions, and not to mention that definitely in society that question is not settled, and we cannot say that there is prevalent support for introduction of, for example, same-sex partnerships. So in that sense, there is no rigorous research about the public opinion on these matters. So I'm just saying all of this now as an observer. These are some of my notes, not necessarily true, but that's how I perceive it. But there's no official data on these issues, I think, at least in Serbia.
Thank you, Theodora. Pass the floor to Turing.
Yeah, thank you. So if I understood correctly, Oliver, your question whether there are more liberal tendencies on the social dimension as opposed to the more formal progressive EU reforms. I think that if that was your question, yeah, I could just think of two, in fact, not very much related, especially the second example is not very much related, but it came to my mind because it does relate to youth, to young people. But the first one, the example that came to my mind was a draft law on that was put forward, but I think it has been withdrawn, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm not entirely sure on this. It was a draft law put forward by the government on the regulation of social media, under this argument that of the whole discussion of fake news and these things. And what are the limits of statements and declarations on social media? And I remember, I think that was 1 year ago or so, and I remember that triggered quite a reaction from civil society, especially media organizations, journalists. But I have to say I didn't follow it up later on, so I don't know, but I don't think that was passed in the end. So and I think there were also statements by the EU representatives, if I'm not mistaken. So that was one. So there are these attempts from time to time on certain aspects. And then there another second example, but as I said, it's not really an example of a liberal I don't know, approach or attitude. It's more about how actually the involvement of young people triggered a very important discussion. It was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago in Albania, a whole protesting of students on the streets, and it all started with from a very small issue. It was about a registration fee that students in universities had to pay, and that they would not get that back even if they would not take the exam, the final exam of the course. So it was really triggered by a very small, maybe not so much significant issue, but this triggered a whole discussion on the quality of universities and education in Albania. And that was actually one of the rare one of the nice examples, I would say. Even I'm not using the word rare because it looks as if nothing goes on, but a very good example of how, in fact, students, went on the streets and they were protesting, and then this whole this very perhaps insignificant issue, financial issue, this triggered a whole discussion on, as I said, level of education, but also, for instance, issues such as plagiarism and quality of university staff and research and so on and so forth. And then the government reacted by establishing the so-called Pact with the university. And this Pact with the university was some kind of agreement or commitment by the government to improve the conditions generally in the universities, being these infrastructure, but also to when it comes to quality of research and education. And I think, and that is, by the way, this pact with the university is also part of the national plan on European integration. So there is a link there also with, you know, it comes also within the context of the commitments and the reforms that the country has to undertake in order to open accession negotiations. So yeah, how much of that is put in practice is a different issue, which, I mean, it would be difficult for me to assess it. But I can give you one small example. For instance, very recently, the whole board of accreditation of universities in Albania was renewed, and it now is composed of university professors coming from abroad. And the whole idea was to have this new independent body that would, you know, assess the quality of universities in a more impartial and independent manner. So yeah, there are, I think, small steps that are taken there, but that's it for the two examples I could think of.
Thank you, Turing. I think your examples there of living conditions in universities leading to protests is quite reminiscent of the 1968 uprisings in Western Europe, a very similar trail. I see Alison McDonald has a hand up. Theodora, is your point on this previous question?
Yes, but I don't want to hold that question any longer. I just wanted to add something, but I can do it later, no problem.
It's okay, you can add now and then we can come to us.
Okay. Now I just wanted to I was thinking now while I was listening, it's important when your question was whether there are some illiberal tendencies currently visible in our sphere. It's important to mention that a lot of things currently are bad in Serbia, and a lot of things the government, the government is doing. For example, there are huge protests happening right now in Serbia due to environmental concerns and due to the recent law on expropriation, which was adopted in Parliament. So those are very concerning developments, but I would not necessarily call them illiberal. So in that sense, I think it's important just to differentiate between some just bad politics and illiberal tendencies. In that sense, we should not, I mean, I'm saying this because I was thinking whether that's illiberal or not. And my opinion, it's just bad, but it's not illiberal. So in that sense, we should know what we're discussing when we say that something specifically is illiberal. And I don't think that kind of tendency is visible in Serbia right now.
Thank you, Taylor. And yes, very important distinction to make between maybe illiberal or maladministration forms of bad governance. So I'd like to give the floor to Alison McDonald, who I believe has a question for the panel. She has her hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I got two different messages at the same time, and I wasn't sure how I could turn the mute off. A question basically for Patrick, but what Theodora just said means that comes in on that as well. This panel is about young people, and you mentioned that young people in Poland are not so easily engaged with the rather abstract rule of law debate, but are more open to discussions on climate change, environmental protection, etc., etc. Now, we know that the Polish ruling party and government use the rhetoric in relation to the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary that the European Union shouldn't get involved, that it's a national question. Now, I wonder whether you could say anything about the relationship between the EU and Poland on this more environmental and climate change issue, which is something that does speak to young people, and where the EU has also had confrontations with Poland about that. I mean, I can't pronounce it properly, the Bielowieża forest and the coal mining as well. This is sometimes in relation to Czechoslovakia, Czech Republic, I mean. But I wonder whether this is something that young people would connect to the EU as well. And that could also be a question for Theodora, where she says that also the environment is something which does get young people motivated. And would that be a more positive trend, perhaps?
Thank you, Alison. Patrick?
Thank you, Alison, for your question. I think, and from what I observe, I must say that yes, at the very large, the environmental issues concerning the climate change, the need to address the climate change, are hugely related to the policies of the European Union, but also to other international organizations, such as the recent meeting of the General Assembly of the UN, for example, or the COP conference that took place in Glasgow, as I recall, recently. And I am not quite sure, but I think that if you ask young people protesting against government policies to not to address the climate change, or to neglect the issue of the Turów mine in the border between Poland and Czech Republic, or previously in 2016-17, the question of Białowieża forest close to the Belarusian border. I think this is the biggest wild forest in Europe. I think, by the way. So if you ask those people advocating for those issues, I think they are almost all of them are pro-European Union. Of course, young people tend to be very radical. Some, according to surveys in Poland, people between 18 and 25 are split between very radical left and very radical right. And probably that is why they are not engaged in the conflict concerning the rule of law, which is rather a conflict between less far right party and less far left party. And if you look at those issues, even on the very far right, let's call them very conservative or very sometimes even libertarian, young people tend to be aware that, well, the government must do something with climate change, because they know there are objective data that something is happening, and this is not just a, I don't know, planet cycle but this is made by human beings. Yeah, so this is how it looks like. But as I said, and this is more or less related to EU policies. Some will criticize EU for well, interfering with domestic legislation in many other issues. I don't know, consumer protection. This is too much intervention from the EU. Even some environmental policies. But what I can tell you is that the overwhelming majority of young people advocating for climate issues are supporting the European Union and their policies, not because the Polish government is doing something opposite, but they truly believe that these are the solutions for the changes that we observe.
Thank you, Patrick. Theodora, do you have any further response to Alison's question?
Yes, I find it interesting because, in my opinion, the protests which are happening now, environmental protests in Serbia, have nothing to do with the EU, actually. So I don't think that the people protesting right now have EU in mind at all. The biggest concern is actually the fact that Belgrade and the rest of Serbia, but Belgrade has been one of the most polluted cities for months now within Europe, and that's very palpable and visible. So people are actually just, I think this is a purely national issues. It's not somehow related, not to EU, but not even to this global climate change, let's say, forces. I think it's a specific current issue, which are at least I think that's how our people perceive it, as a specific issue which needs to be dealt with now. Obviously, that includes some climate change policies which are long term, but I don't think that that's anyhow connected to the EU, because actually maybe even the contrary, because our government, our current government, which has 2/3 majority, it's very pro-European. So, and I would not say that people who are anti-government are necessarily anti-European. So it's a very complex issue. So in that sense, I would not just divide those things in those categories. Let's just put it that way.
Thank you, Theodora. And then Darinka, I think the final words of the panel.
Yeah, I would not have any specific comment on Alison's question, in fact, because from how I see it, I do see at the moment, especially after the summits and the Glasgow summit and so on, I do see that the government it seems that has become a bit more aware of climate change, but I do not see the same resonance in the public. Unfortunately, not yet. I do think that yeah, it's just, and now reflecting on what Patrick mentioned, and also Theodora, about these current protests, it seems at least I do not remember something going on or something happening in that area in the recent years. And I think we're still busy, or even young people are still busy with other issues that are, I think, mainly, as I mentioned, those educational issues, future in the country or future outside of the country, leaving. So brain drain really, I think, is a big, and employment and everything, and hasn't really reached, I think, us yet, which is really sad to hear and to see. But let's see what will be the response, because it seems, and now that there is a national plan of not only cleaning and the environment, but there is also more awareness, as I said, with regards to climate change. Because now, for instance, we see that there is much more rain in Albania, which then destroys fields and affects clearly the farmer and so on and so forth. So that's becoming more tangible, I think, also as a problem. Slowly, it's really becoming more present, but I don't see the public's awareness yet there.
Thank you, Darinka. Well, perhaps we can derive some positive note from the fact that international efforts such as COP at least have filtered down into the level of the government. So thank you so much to Patrick, Theodora, and Darinka for your illuminating presentation. I'm sure we'll continue our conversations on topics like this within the auspices of Reconnect and also through the Bingham Centre and also Leiden ongoing collaboration. So thank you so much for your interventions. And to close the conference, we'll first move to some closing remarks in person from Alison first. So we'd like to invite Alison McDonald to provide some closing remarks on behalf of Leiden. So the floor is yours, Alison. Thank you again to the panelists.
Thank you. Well, I'll keep it very brief. And the timing is perfect, at least I think it's perfect. It's 5 o'clock here, but it's only 4 o'clock for you. But I think you can't expect to have a full day when you're only online. But I'd like to thank the London End for their efforts and very successful efforts to give an extremely interesting, forward-looking 60th anniversary London-Leiden meeting. And to any of you who can look that far ahead, maybe we've managed to get further with Corona than we are at the moment. Leiden will be hopefully hosting maybe even a physical, real Leiden-London meeting on the last Saturday of June in Leiden. And we don't have our topic yet, but watch this space. But in the meantime, thank you very much for organizing this, and we've had a great day.
Thank you.
Yes, I have a couple of questions, Alison, of a practical nature. First of all, also a statement, which is that we had planned a nice lunch for you here, and you haven't missed anything, because we have very dutifully, with the few personal attendees, just had our usual sandwiches, which you know, we haven't had for a few years here on the premises. But you know, that was fine. I actually, as I speak, I can see a couple of glasses. I was wondering if I could lift a glass to you, because you know, we do have what is called a reception. I think Lawrence is running, but we have a reception, except we don't have people, so we really need you. My practical question, here we are, before, yeah, okay. So anyway, thank you very much for attending. As you know, this was not intended this way. I think we've all done our utmost. I think the sessions, were married very well together. My practical question is, and you've hinted at that, do you have an ambition of sticking to the usual timetable of the last weekend in June, beginning of July, or? That's what I said, Margot. The last Saturday in June, and I don't have my diary around, so I'm not sure whether it's the 24th or the 23rd or the 25th, but in principle, the last Saturday in June in Leiden. That's the aim. The 25th of June. The 25th of June, and that is certainly the aim. And we also, we all miss you. It's the upper halves always amuse me, because you don't know what happens to the rest of us, so to say, under the table. But certainly speaking personally, my feet are swollen up to twice its size because I need to put them up. But we will try. We had planned for you to, at least two of you, to come over. So Lawrence in the end has represented it beautifully. Oliver has, I must say this because I know, we're on the same side, so to say, but he has made Herculean efforts to put this together. And as I say, we had planned a sort of a proper lunch, as you call it, rightly, to have sort of down the road. But that was obviously, not
just to add, Margot, that,
yeah.
This is a suitable occasion perhaps to emphasize that the academic debate and the discussion and the friendships at London and Leiden and the other universities and institutions which cooperate with both of those will remain and will be undiminished by Brexit. And please, Alison, do make sure that that message comes very much home in Leiden, that with us it's business as usual.
And not only undiminished by Brexit, but as the last session has proved, I just hope that our friends from you know, sort of the what's called the backsliding countries will also make their way to Leiden if we can all get together.
Yeah,
I know that's, you know, last year we would have made the same vow, but just let's keep optimistic. You know, we've weathered worse storms than even Brexit, and let's just keep, you know, do the next 60 years, or at least some of you, the next 60 years as we've done the last month.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Margaret. Thank you to all of the participants today. Cheers. Cheers to you all.
Yeah.
Thank you again.